thank our sponsors, the Davis Restaurant, been so supportive all these years, and Tom Camus, and also the Campbell House, a wonderful place to stay when you're in town. Just to say just a word about Energy Village. We have been working on this idea for about 10 years, and our goal is to someday have a physical center where we could have ongoing thinking and education and demonstration. Also, Nora Bateson is on her way. Her flight is delayed, so she will be joining us much later. And she will be here tomorrow for her film that we'll be showing at the Bijou, and there to answer questions and have a discussion with all of you after the film. So let me introduce our panelists tonight. We're going to be exploring Gregory Bateson's work and how it's relevant today. And with us we have Artemio Paz, a local architect, and he has been on the State Board of Education. He's vice chair for 6.5 years, and also a blueberry farmer. And so we're so glad he could be here with us tonight. And Professor Chet Bowers, an author. He's been writing on the educational reforms that address the cultural roots of the ecological crisis. And I'm holding one of his books here, Perspectives on the Ideas of Gregory Bateson, Ecological Intelligence and Educational Reform. So without further ado, here are our speakers.
Well, I'd like to repeat Susanna's thank you for showing up on such an evening. Thought everybody would kind of hunker down, especially after the last few days, but good to see you here. And I also want to thank Susanna and Kevin for doing this, putting this together. It's a lot of work, and I hope we're able to present some ideas that break through some of the misconceptions that are being passed on at the public school and university level. I'm going to be talking about only certain aspects of Gregory Bateson's thinking. As most of you may know, he's written several books, but the two most important in terms of talking about addressing the cultural roots of the ecological crisis are Steps to an Ecology of Mind and Mind and Nature. I think he's one of the most important thinkers of this 21st century, and I'm beginning to make a real divide in terms of people who are educated and do not know anything about Bateson, who were educated in the last decades of the last century. And I think we're caught in what he calls a double bind. That is, we're carrying forward ideas that made sense during the conceptual moral framework that led to the Industrial Revolution that's causing such havoc in terms of natural systems, changing the chemistry of the oceans, global warming, the loss of potable water, loss of glaciers, loss of habitat, all the chemicals that are now put into the environment by scientists who are assuming that they were engaged in a progressive activity. And people tend not to look at that. Where did those chemicals, where did those toxins come from, and what were the cultural assumptions that led to these achievements, which in many ways were achievements, but they also had a downside. So what I'm going to do, and then it's too bad that Nora cannot be with us. She just flew in from Stockholm, Sweden, landed in Seattle at 12 o'clock, and then probably took a very rough flight down to Eugene, given the weather, and she may not be here until 8:30 or so.
Even later.
Even later. Well, you'll have a chance to engage her in a conversation tomorrow after you see her film. I do hope you come out for it. It's at the Bijou. Anyway, Bateson's thinking has been influential in a wide range of fields, from psychotherapy to anthropology to linguistics. Not much in terms of thinking about educational reform. But my task here is to bring out just how radical and how grounded his ideas are, and how they're profoundly different from so much of what goes on in public schools and universities. And I will try to touch on the problems connected with print and how print undermines what Bateson is trying to get us to recognize about how we live in the world. So what I'm going to do is just talk about those aspects of his thinking that seem particularly relevant to both a critique of what's going on in public schools and universities, as well as a way of reframing so that we begin to recognize that we are ecological thinkers, and that the task of the educational process is to move us beyond the myths of the last centuries. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to 4 core ideas of his. And if you've read Bateson, I think you're going to find that he's a difficult read. And I'm going to demonstrate that. I hope I have enough copies. Kevin, would you mind passing this out? Let me make that point a little clearer if I can. I'm beginning to recognize that professors and in turn people who educated teachers in the last decades of the last century, and I like the ability to be able to say the 21st and the 20th, and that there's a real divide there, in that many of the patterns of thinking in the 20th century did not address the cultural roots of the ecological crisis. There was a great deal of focus on the environmental aspects of the environmental crisis, but not on how do we think and to what extent are we reproducing earlier patterns of thinking that we tend not to be aware of. So does everybody have? Okay. Let me read this, the first one, just to give you an idea of how difficult, how radical, and I don't mean radical in the sense of progress, but I mean radical in the sense of going back to the basic roots Bateson's thinking is. He says the total self-correcting unit which processes information, or as I say, thinks and acts and decides, is a system whose boundaries do not at all coincide with the boundaries either of the body or what is properly called self or consciousness. And it is important to notice that these are multiple differences between the thinking system and the self as properly conceived. Sorry about the bad reading. I think you get the idea. Can you make sense of that?
It hurts. It's between the thinker and the environment.
Okay. But I think this is really, that's right. But what is the environment? I'm going to use some words, some metaphors in a way that are not part of the conventional way of using them. I'm going to use the word ecology to refer to all interactions between individuals and organic processes and natural systems. In other words, I'm trying to move away from, and I'm using Bateson to move away from the notion that we are autonomous, rational thinkers in the way in which René Descartes and others described intelligence. And I think this is what universities and public schools are still reinforcing, and that is the notion that intelligence is an autonomous activity, a mental process, and that the more you can access data, information, and so on through computers, the more intelligent, the more you can construct your own ideas. I think this is deeply problematic, and I'll try to make a connection between that and how print, rather than orality, how print fosters abstract thinking, and thus an indifference to what I'm calling, what Bateson's calling an ecology, and there's another statement here that will get at that. So what I'm going to try to do here is to bring out how Bateson helps us understand that thinking isn't an individual activity, although we're involved, although we have biographically distinct identities, but we are not autonomous, and we're not free. So let me lay out those key ideas. I'll try to keep this within 20 minutes. I've already used up 15.
There's lots of time.
But we want some time for exchange and questions and Art's important presentation. Bateson has a number of key ideas that I expand on in this book I've published and elsewhere. One of them is he points out that in the West we have this tradition of what he calls recursive epistemologies. Now recursion means the repeating of pattern over time. And what he means by epistemologies would be cultural ways of knowing, or what I would prefer to refer to as root metaphors. And root metaphors are these deep, historically, taken for granted interpretive frameworks that are sustained by a particular vocabulary and that exclude other vocabularies that lead to other ways of thinking. So an example of a root metaphor would be patriarchy that survived over thousands of years, influencing behavior, relationships, activities, rights, and so on across a broad range of cultural activities. And many of us have now become aware that that root metaphor is faulty. We can see where it began in terms of a mythopoetic narrative. And anthropocentrism would be another root metaphor, human-centered. The environment is ours to exploit. We can own it as property, and so on. Other root metaphors would be mechanism, that this world is a machine-like process and we can experiment with it, we can change its components, we can measure its efficiencies and so on. And its vocabulary now has entered into how we think about the brain, how we think about medical practices, how we think about agriculture. In other words, this root metaphor becomes a powerful interpretive framework that goes back at least to Johann Kepler in the 1600s. And it's now viewed as a cutting edge interpretive framework. So the question is, what are the vocabularies that preclude thinking about other possibilities? So other root metaphors would include individualism, economism, that is, think of everything in terms of money, and just pay attention to the current political campaign. That vocabulary excludes talking about the environment. It includes talking about social justice issues in any deep and consistent kind of way. It excludes talking about spirituality and so on. So root metaphors, and there are a couple of others that are really important, and I'm not saying I've given you an exhaustive list, but other root metaphors include progress, and that root metaphor, change, innovation, experimentation, all these words support that notion. And in terms of that interpretive framework, we don't ask the question, what are we losing? I mean, and we're losing a lot of very important aspects of life. And we're moving in a certain political direction because we take those innovations for granted. We're about to lose habeas corpus because of this notion of technological progress. Evolution is another root metaphor, and now they've extended its explanatory power to explain cultural memes, and that is all aspects of culture are subject to the same process of natural selection. And I think ecology is emerging as a root metaphor. Okay, so what Bateson is saying about Western culture is that we have these recursive, that is, repeating patterns of these repeating conceptual frameworks, and we tell each generation that it's the cutting edge way of thinking. And I could go through the university and point out the many ways in which individualism, progress, mechanism, and so on are part of the interpretive framework that influence how the subjects are passed on. So that's a key part. The question is, how many faculty, how many public school teachers are aware that these root metaphors become the taken for granted or metacognitive schematic? I'm sorry, Mary, she said don't say big. She said avoid these.
That's all right.
But these are the taken for granted interpretive frameworks. And when we're born into the language community, we learn these interpretive frameworks just as we learn the difference between males and females in terms of that root metaphor, or the notion that change is inherently progressive. So what else is there in Bateson's thinking? Well, he has a very catchy phrase in talking about another aspect of language, and that is where he says, the map is not the territory. What he's saying, in effect, is that all words, except prepositions and conjunctions, are metaphors. And metaphors take on their meaning in terms of analogies, like it's asking the question, what is something like? What is the computer like? And 1955 at a conference in Dartmouth, they were trying to figure out how do we understand what this computer does. And so they thought, well, it's like intelligence. So they came up with the phrase artificial intelligence. So there's that process of thinking of something as like. What is the environment like? Like a source of danger, something that is to be owned or something to be exploited. What is a woman like? 4 or 5 career possibilities. Okay, we've reformulated the metaphor woman to be a whole range of possibilities: painter, engineer, astronaut, and so on. We're rethinking the nature of environment as a metaphor, where now we're beginning to see that we shouldn't use it simply in terms of an exploitable resource. So the challenge, educationally speaking, is for students to realize that the map is not the territory. So the map is always designed by somebody thinking about how other people should make sense of the world they're moving through. In other words, the map precedes the situation and reflects the thought process of the map maker. So these earlier metaphors, individualism, intelligence, tradition, progress, data. I mean, where do we get this notion that data is objective? Well, we got it because Durkheim and Weber wanted their field of sociology to be a science. And they had to make the case that science yields objective knowledge. So data is free of cultural influences and interpretations. So this notion of the map and the territory is critical for educators to understand at both the university and public school level. And that is, it's very simple. Words have a history. So we can talk about the ecology of words. What were the antecedents? What were the metaphors that were settled upon in the past and that are carried forward? But we don't tell students that these are that these words encode the level of intelligence or lack of intelligence of earlier thinkers. Okay, so the past continues to, and that's why this statement I handed out here about thinking isn't just what goes on in here. He's saying thinking is part of a larger system, a language system. And earlier forms of intelligence are encoded in that language system, and we reproduce those thought processes. Now, questions about that? What comes out of this is that languages, not only English, but other languages are also metaphorical. So when we teach English to within another culture, we're passing on what I call the linguistic colonization of the present by the past. We're all caught in this historical process, this ecology, and ecology has antecedents. It has its own current relationships and it has implications for the future. So we're all caught in this double bind, which I'll try to explain shortly what he means by that concept. Well, let me very quickly say what double bind is. Double bind involves being caught in a situation where you think you're making progress or the right moves, thinking the right thoughts, but they're actually contributing to further problems that you're not aware of. And it's just like now we're caught in a double bind where politicians will say we must get back to expanding the economy, get back to previous levels of consumerism, and at the same time we're caught in that the more we do that, the more we accelerate the ecological crisis in terms of changing the chemistry of the world's oceans and the loss of potable water and so on. That's a double bind. It's a double bind for students who now are going into debt, 40, 50, more thousands of dollars, and the economy is such that they will get, if they're lucky, minimum wage jobs. So there's a double bind there. How do you get out of that? Because you go into it thinking you've made the right decisions. So double bind is it was expressed very clearly by Albert Einstein when he said, we can't use the same mindset that created the problems to fix it. That's double bind, where we're still caught in this industrial mindset based on these root metaphors of mechanism, progress, individualism, economism, and what was that other one? I feel like that guy from Texas.
So this is communication that includes incompatible narratives then?
They're destructive in the sense that they're based on earlier ways of thinking, earlier misconceptions and silences. And some of these earlier ways of thinking were very insightful and sources of wisdom, okay? But what Bateson is bringing out is that we are not autonomous thinkers. If we think in a language, we are being thought by that language to a large extent. And so the task of the professor and classroom teachers is to point out that words have a history, and let's go back and look at where these words came from and what happens when you introduce these words in another culture. What happens when we introduce the modernizing vocabulary of economism and progress in a third world country where the key words are development, modernization, literacy, avoid backward, you've got to develop. That's a form of linguistic colonization. Another concept, and this is really difficult to get a hold of, and it's ironic because what Bateson is referring to is something that goes around us all the time. In fact, it's basic to how we exist in the world. And that is where he says that the only thing that gets mapped onto awareness are differences which make a difference. Now, start a conversation with your friends with that as an opener and see where that takes you. But now this brings out that Bateson is not an idealist. He's not theoretical in the sense of talking about how things could be. He's talking about how things are, and differences which make a difference occur whether you're preparing a meal, talking to somebody, playing an instrument in a musical group, engaged in designing something. You're always seeing a difference that you respond to. Okay, and when we drive these cars that put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that leads to a whole series of differences. And here's where language and the awareness of differences become very important. If people are socialized to think of themselves as autonomous individuals, as engaged in activities that are inherently modernizing and progressive, and that the purpose in life is to consume as much as possible, then you're not going to be aware of the differences taking place as a result of your behaviors. See, I think we got the word ecology from a German biologist, and he's the guy who incidentally introduced social Darwinism into Germany. And now there's a book out which points out that the Nazis' agenda was really a social Darwinian agenda. That kind of blows one away when you begin to look at that as what was really going on, and how social Darwinism is the underlying process of thinking of many of our leading thinkers, such as John Dewey. So, ecological intelligence is something that goes on as we interact with each other. In a conversation, we're paying attention to differences which make a difference. If a person looks at their watch, if they start putting their clothes on, I mean, the body language, meta patterns of communication is a constant series of information or differences which make a difference that we respond to. So the challenge that we need to address is, how do we get students or young people or even older people, which is a harder task in many cases, to pay attention to how the differences which make a difference need to be framed not in terms of one's personal interests and strategies for getting ahead, but how behaviors affect the nature of the other participants in these ecologies, whether it's a social ecology or a natural ecology. The word ecology came from the Greek oikos, that term, and people didn't go back and look at that. The guy who gave us the narrowed interpretation of that identified it in terms of the study of natural systems. But the ancient Greeks understood it as all the activities except for the polis. So ecology included for them the whole range of cultural activities and relationships that one pays attention to and responds to, but they didn't have the natural system part of it. So what I'm trying to do with Bateson's idea is to introduce the notion that we need to reinforce the notion of ecological intelligence, and that is, and this is another insight of Bateson, he says, I don't understand the individual, I only understand the relationships of the individual. See, and that's where he's saying we always exist in relationships. And it's what characterizes these relationships are differences which make a difference. And it may be in the language, the body language, it may be in other people and how they respond and so on. And it certainly has something to do with what occurs at the molecular level, at the whole systems level, and as well as at the human level. Now, just one more point, and I'll turn this over to Art. If an ecological intelligence means paying attention to how our behaviors, our thoughts become the differences that others respond to, including, if I'm ignorant of the difference between native and non-native plants, I will plant a rhododendron, and if I'm not aware, because of prior conditioning and thought process and language, I may not be aware that pollinators are not going to come to the plants that are non-native. Okay? So ecological intelligence means paying attention to the patterns that connect. Now, I want to just say a word, and this opens up a whole door of interesting issues, and that is cultural linguists are beginning to tell us that there's a difference between orality and literacy, and that there's a difference in consciousness between those two modes of communication. And the point that they make that's particularly interesting and relevant in terms of Bateson's idea is that print fosters abstract thought, which means, as they put it, you only have a surface knowledge of what is represented in print. Which means then your relationship is visual, and Bateson is saying that we rely upon all of our senses in responding to this ecology of differences, whether it's interpersonal or social or at the biological level. So the point is that the more we reinforce print-based thinking, that is abstract thinking, through computer-mediated learning, and that's the big trend now. Students need to learn more through computers because they have access to information, data. The world is open to them in terms of the internet. But the important point is that they're being desensitized in terms of awareness of the patterns that connect around them. And I think it can also be made clear, or make the point, that the use of computers fosters cultural amnesia. An ecology has a history. So that our institutions, separation of church and state, habeas corpus, all of those things are part of a history. And there are many traditions that are important in terms of the cultural commons, which Bateson does not write about. And it's important then that we begin to look at whether the use of computers and how it fosters abstract thinking, and also a false sense of empowerment, because there are a number of double binds there. That the more we rely upon computers, the more we move toward a police state. That is a total surveillance society. And there are greater risks now in terms of various forms of computer terrorism, in terms of disrupting energy systems and so on. Okay, so let me stop there. Turn it over to Art.
Thank you, Chet. And I also want to acknowledge that I feel privileged that I can be a part of this conversation, and that you all came out on this really crazy evening. I want to start out and state that when you look at what's occurring in Oregon and nationally and internationally, the point that Chet, or some of the issues that Chet is raising really can be distilled down to a huge shift in the way we think about classroom knowledge and the kind of dialogue or discourse that young learners, as well as adults, need to structure. When Chet uses the term ecological intelligence and then defines that as an epistemology of critical analytical processes that both take in natural systems as well as social systems, that's a huge shift when you look at Race to the Top, No Child Left Behind, Elementary Secondary Education Act. They're thinking that you can essentially left brain this whole learning process and streamline it and make it very, very efficient. It so happens that Oregon is one of the most efficient at electronic assessment. So much so that the federal government granted Oregon about $150,000 as a member of a consortium of states that would look at electronic assessment of new Common Core state standards. And new Common Core state standards comes out of this preoccupation for accountability and return on investment. And the first two curriculum areas that were rolled out in this national dialogue of new standards. Common Core articulated English language arts and math. And they rolled that out, and then the feds indicated that they weren't going to push it on any particular state. The states were going to pick it up because it was a good idea. Well, there's an organization called Achieve, and the National Governors Association got together and said, you know, we need to do something. Because way back in 1983, a nation at risk indicated that we're not conducting the kind of critical thinking skill development that we want in classrooms. So you had the private sector stating that there's a lot of growth that they would like to engage, but they can't find the qualified people in these local communities. So what do they have to do? They have to outsource. Because if they look at national standards, they can look at people that perform in foreign countries at higher levels. And you've got the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris doing all of the international assessment and comparing all of the developed nations, and they're coming up with the U.S. being 17th through 21st in science and math out of 34 to 43 nations, depending on what group they assess. And then you've got the National Governors Association saying, we told you that that was the reality. We need to change what occurs in classrooms. So the difference that makes a difference that Chet is referring to, that Bateson said was important for a critical interpretive framework, is really all of the root metaphors that Chet has elaborated on. Anthropomorphic, independent learning, and a way of being creative, innovative, and creative students are innovative when they can deal independently with these abstract relationships that are based on text. I can tell you that I grew up in a family in California, and my parents are Puerto Rican. So they spoke Spanish at home. And my brother, who was my senior by 2 years, was mixing a little bit of Spanish and English in elementary school. So the teachers called and spoke to my mother and said, do not teach these kids Spanish. Okay? Got it? This is a different place, and it is English. So I go through a university and get a bachelor's in architecture, and then get a master's in architecture, and then end up in Los Angeles designing a performing arts theater that is probably 3/4 to 7/8 the size of the Holt Center, but I'm down in Los Angeles doing this. And I'm having dinner with my mother on a daily basis. And this lady is talking like Joseph Campbell, and I'm wondering, how in the hell did I ever miss the wisdom in this family? And what occurs is when you've got root metaphors that really talk about the exclusive nature of research and text, you lose the intergenerational knowledge that is bound culturally and also within the larger social systems and the natural systems. Because all of this race to the top really is very, very abstract. And if you look at Oregon, Achieve 2.5 years ago came to Salem, and as a member of the board for almost 4 years at that time, I'm listening to all this dialogue on how Oregon is moving forward and we're really progressive. And this woman from the National Organization of Achieve says, you know, Oregon is really doing okay. they have the same number of states above them as they do below them. And I'm thinking, that kind of reality needs to be up front at all of the state board meetings. We need to find out if the narrative really has any substance, and if what we're doing and shaping has validity. If you look at Common Core state standards, that allowed all of the states to buy into money that was coming down the pipeline from the feds. And if you didn't buy into Common Core state standards, the feds wouldn't even look at you. You couldn't play the game. Oregon played the game, submitted something, ended up with a lot of egg on its face because they couldn't get a total endorsement from all of the school districts that they would change unions and they would change different processes of hiring. And the feds were looking at that. They wanted that. They wanted charter schools. They wanted a new format that they could manipulate. And if you're willing to play the game, they would pay the players. And so you see this now. I'm not from education. I speak to certain groups and I interact with people and they say, Dr. Paz. I'm saying, no. I'm just an architect that likes to understand the fundamental premise. I want to find out where my foundation is and how I'm sustaining the complexity of whatever I'm working on. And I think that what Chet really laid out is really critical because it defines an interpretive system that is much richer than what most schools and most people are talking about anywhere nationally and certainly in Oregon. And I can tell you it's a privilege to be around Chet and hear him articulate a really deep understanding of relevant learning experiences and also experiences that create well-being for the community. About 10 days ago, I was amongst a small group that was visiting with the governor, and he wanted our feedback on the Oregon educational board that has just been started, the investment board. And after he made a generic overall presentation, I indicated that I took issue with the way we're relating to communities. That too much of what is occurring in academia still happens in the classroom or the administrative structure and has very little and incidental relationship with the broader community. And so there were three issues that I thought that he could frame under formative community relationships. And the first one was that Ralph Schwartz, who is a doctor that teaches, a professor at the educational school at Harvard, was one of the champions for Common Core state standards and one of the cheerleaders with Achieve when they rolled out all of this a couple of years ago. In the interim, a year ago, he published a paper on Pathway to Prosperity that acknowledges the 50% that are not being addressed in our traditional educational structures. He went to Europe and found out that career technical education that tied people to crafts experience and deeper understandings of how you apply math and decision making and create well-being was something that we were not addressing. He went to Asia and found out that the Asians were developing deeper understandings of career technical applications. So you knew how to make something, and you historically looked at mentors and other people in the community that had real experience with materials, and you could transfer that to young people. So Schwartz, who was the champion for that traditional left brain, came back and said, we need a broader application of this. The other issue I would say is Oregon's new direction does not move in that career technical education area, which help a lot of people, especially people from multicultural backgrounds. They're looking at immediate well-being. And colleges are very, very abstract. And community colleges can be very abstract. So they're looking at immediate well-being, which means that they're already looking at careers when they're about 12 to 14 years of age. And if the system's not helping them, they're dropping out. If you look at people of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans, what is occurring is we're boutiquing the system. And it does not reach a real diverse kind of populace, and it certainly doesn't reach all the people that No Child Left Behind was talking about. And one good characteristic of No Child Left Behind was that it just aggregated all of the information. So you knew who was succeeding and who wasn't. And so right in the glare of all of this attention, people could look in the mirror and see who's falling off the table. How do we deal with this? And that's an issue. So the career technical outreach, I think, is embedded in the community. It's embedded in labor unions. It's embedded in trade experiences. That's one area. The other area is ecological intelligence. Says you really need to structure ecological intelligence. And Oregon just endorsed about a year ago, and it was Kitzhofer, our new governor, who endorsed a National Career Readiness Certificate. So if you want to get into the work world, you would take this exam that assessed literacy and numeracy and also spatial skills. Not a single concept on the natural environment. We're going to move you through this system, and all you have to do is understand these kinds of things. I think that it undermines, again, the deeper relationship we have with natural systems. And it certainly is an area that I think ecological intelligence is embedded in, that starts to articulate the ideas that the governor and most of the educational reform people don't understand. And they understand certain environmental issues, but as an appendage to doing business as usual. And you need to understand that, because there is no deep understanding at the level of the difference that makes a difference. They marginalize the environment, and it is everywhere. And when you talk about ecological intelligence, they cite various gardens and waste cycling that's occurring on campuses and things like that. But they can't talk to me about food security. They don't tell me about an investment in a campus that could actually generate electricity and help a neighborhood. They don't tell me about the gardens that could be worked throughout the summer with the neighbors and have a deeper relationship to the community. And so I think that that's the kind of ecological, which is a social and natural framework that is missing. And the third item that I commented on to the governor was the fact that people of color are really seeing this as a boutique system. And you have not transformed it in a way that has a relevance and meaning. And that has to change. The OECD, with all of their examination, you have to be aware that they look at classroom knowledge, and if you've mastered classroom knowledge, they will give you a C on your ability. Only if you understand how the classroom knowledge is applied to the community will they give you an A or a B. That's quite a shift. But when you dig deeper into understanding how the OECD understands sustainability and natural systems. They understand it from the standpoint of exploiting natural systems that are renewable. And so they never get into that deeper conversation. It is more business as usual at a higher speed. And then when you look at the Chinese in Shanghai and Hong Kong at the last OECD examination, and it was the first time that they had assessed the Chinese, they said, my gosh, they knocked the socks right off the chart on this exam. They beat the Finns, they beat the Japanese, and those folks in Singapore. They're doing something really right. Well, they're really doing some left brain stuff. The other thing that they said was they're doing some very creative and innovative things. They can't be because the framework is never addressing that. So you have to understand that there is quite a modest or dumbed down notion of intellectual intelligence that is being pushed. And if you look at Achieve, if you look at the foundations, the Gates Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, they're all providing money in some form so that states collaborate or that a particular state will innovate within the context of this old root metaphor of anthropocentric, individual, creative innovation. And the whole notion that that Bateson would get into, where you need level 3 analytical processes. Level 1 he described as, if you're familiar with behavior modification, that was really popular in the 80s, immediate reward with that M&M. Well, that behavioral modification was immediate reward. The immediate reward right now is jobs. Abstract notions of jobs. And if you really understand that abstract notion, we can position you in positions and places that you never imagined. We can move you all over the world, all over this nation, and if you really understand it, you're willing to move. It has nothing to do with understanding a local ecological system, natural and sociological. The second level, Bateson stated that students accept the taken for granted knowledge. Well, that's the mantra of Oregon and all of the other states. If you look at essential skills, we're saying that you have to have knowledge and skills in math and numeracy and social studies and a little bit of science and PE. But if you really look at essential skills, you're a critical thinker, you innovate, you're a problem solver, you're able to read mixed text of different complexity. You will share as a team member, but it never gets into relating to the community. It was the past governor that said, essential skills for Oregon students should really incorporate citizenship. And then I said, it should really incorporate global awareness. If I have a farmer in Eastern Oregon that's raising potatoes and he's got it down to a couple of genes and he creates his potato, I want him to be aware in Chile, in some of the mountain areas, in an elevation change of 1,000 feet, you might have 40 or 60 potatoes, and if some disease attacks them, that they're going to survive. But the fellow in Eastern Oregon is not. So that's the kind of international or global intelligence, and then I want them to understand that language and culture is that enrichment that may actually inform the way they perform decision making at any one time. within the family and with the community. With that, I think that I'd like to stop, because I think a lot of people are tossing around sustainability, and there is one interesting thing that's happening in Oregon. There is a group that is a part of a national organization that is trying to share ideas of no child left inside, and that pushes them outside so that they understand natural systems. And that group in Oregon, under House Bill 2544, legislature wanted to find out how we could address this issue. And they called it the Oregon Environmental Literacy Plan. There it is. And it uses the term sustainability. And it defines that. It does not go into the depth and to the richness that Chet has acknowledged, and also Bateson has characterized as valid decision-making, important decision-making, fundamental decision-making. But I think that one other area, if you're looking at change and it doesn't have high priority, is social studies. Social studies, Oregon just turned out their new social study curriculum, and they worked on it for about 18 months. And the chief writer approached me and indicated, Art, I cannot use the word sustainability. Right. And I said, you must use the word sustainability. That's not a question. You need to get beyond radical kinds of uses and interpretations of that word. And if you're having difficulty, use terms like resilience and social well-being or community well-being. The state board adopted the curriculum for social studies, and the first 3 years, up to the 3rd grade, they taught quite a bit about the natural environment and how you describe the natural environment. And from that point on, the 4th grade on, they're using the term sustainability. They're using it because they're trying to frame broader contextual frameworks for decision making. And so there are some pieces that are in play, but I can tell you the majority of what is occurring treats ecological intelligence and its notion as just a manifestation of something that is an appendage to what we normally do, and that's a problem.
On that last, do you think that could come from 30 years where workforce development and economic development have been the primary imperatives, starting about the 1980 recession here?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. But those folks are very well organized. What I don't see are the people that are willing to go to the board and challenge the policymakers. And that, I think, is really something that our communities need to do. So this formative community relationship is the piece that the governor and most of the educational reformers don't get. And that richness needs to come from face-to-face reactions with people to articulate deeper understandings of knowledge and skills and well-being for a community. So I think I'm just going to turn it over to Chet, and I don't know if Nora is.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Nora's not yet. Okay. Oh, okay. All right.
Let me just add another dimension to this, and that is that people who are engaged in the activities and relationships that are called the cultural commons, which is the intergenerational knowledge, skills, and mentoring relationships around a whole series of activities that have not been monetized. That's the key point. What is it that we do as part of community that have not been monetized? That's really important for students to learn about and to begin participating in the community, especially now that technology, the role of computers is eliminating the need for workers. And that process is accelerating. So we're going to have more and more people with this 20th century education. That is where they get this notion of progress, individualism, and all of the rest of that, and abstract thinking. They're going to need to understand how the nature of the cultural commons, creative arts, crafts, games, healing practices, narratives, ceremonies, food issues, civil liberties, language itself. If they're going to have a subsistence existence, a quality of life, which we see people having who are engaged in what is euphemistically called voluntary simplicity, we're going to have hordes of people, young people, who are going to be engaged in involuntary simplicity. So ecological intelligence is best manifested when you're working with a weaver or a person in a craft area or in theater or in other activities where you're paying attention to the history of that, the knowledge that's carried forward, and which becomes the basis then of your own creativity. And you're getting away from this notion that you're an autonomous individual and that you're coming up with your own ideas, and they begin to recognize that they're part of a very complex ecology, an ecology of language, an ecology of identity. I mean, our genes are part of an ecology that connect us in ways that our thought process often discount. So let's open it up for questions here.
Well, Chet, I think your emphasis upon getting to young people is probably the key to what's going on. I give up for my generation. I grew up with the ideas of progress and growth and leadership and trying to get ahead, and I think I was saved in some ways in the sense that I got the intellectual ideas that could get me to Bateson, it could get me to Lewis Mumford, it could get me to the Odoms, and could get me to the whole range of things. But I still go ahead and drive my car, I still go ahead and fly off to Oaxaca, I still go ahead and eat processed foods, I still do all, and I can't change. I really can't change. Just as no one in this room can change completely. Some of the people that are younger than I can change a little bit. They can recognize the problems, but we're locked into this. So it has to be, I think, the young children that got the ideas that they can do these things, think about the world in a different way, because they aren't quite locked into it. It's all of us are locked into it. I think the efforts that the state board or the people in education are trying to do is great, but it's one hell of a long ways off from what really has to happen, because it's still in lockstep of one order and another order. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Chet, about get to the young people, get to them as young as you possibly can. And that means getting to parents too, not just education, but getting to parents too, as in this regard.
But there are many examples of youth and even older people who become involved in some aspect of the cultural commons, whether they're picking up weaving or pottery or painting or playwriting or theater or whatever, issues around food. And we see that their priorities begin to shift away from this notion, these abstractions that you mentioned, of individualism, progress. And that's the point I wanted to make, that most of the education of the current faculty and public school teachers was based on print. That is, they were reinforced in thinking in abstract words. And how many wars have we fought in terms of abstractions? Democracy, we didn't have a clue that in Iraq people married their cousins I mean, we thought it was a individualistic yearning for democracy culture. I mean, part of it is paying attention to the differences which make a difference. And if you want an example of that, what is the soccer player doing as she or he runs down the field? Responding to differences, right? Or cooking, or weaving, or playing an instrument.
I graduated high school in 1969. That summer, we landed on the moon for the first time. I entered Oregon State University and was an education major for 2 years. And I was very perturbed at what I perceived to be the School of Education at Oregon State, and I would, by extension, say that probably most schools of education at university level nationwide were like this, and that they are repeating the training of the next round of educators to teach basically the same paradigms, the same metaphors that have been essentially, so that the culture continues based in language forward.
Recursively,
Because
okay.
the schools of education train teachers in much the same way that they were taught. And a number of us were involved at that time in the first Earth Day happened in 1970. We participated, and there was nothing in the curriculum that addressed, for example, in the teacher's curriculum, that we have a major growth in population. It was evident that population would double. I mean, world population has doubled since I graduated in high school. And there was nothing in the curriculum that talked about that and what the implications are for resources, fresh water, quality of life, civil rights, all the things that you talk about. And so if we don't train the next group of teachers, then the big system keeps rolling along and the metaphor continues. And so both of you have articulated concerns about how do we set educational policy that maybe changes the course or direction of how young minds are allowed to effervesce, to learn language.
How do we become aware of what we are not aware of?
That's a conundrum. It's a difficult conundrum because the schools of education, even as you attempt to create new policy, people that are actually doing the training were trained 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The system rolls on. How do you respond to that?
You know, the gentleman to my right made that comment about focusing on the young. I think that that's true, but also I want to take the intergenerational knowledge of the wisdom of that elder community, and I want to push it through. Because this is not about just having good ideas. It's about having rich, complex ideas that deal with complexity and are not just so goal-oriented that they strip richness and complexity. So I want to see, whatever our conversation is, I want to see all the players, and I want to see total transparency, and I want to hear the dialogue of what the root metaphors really are.
I want to expand on that. What art is talking about cannot be communicated in print. Okay, it's in a mentoring relationship. It involves all the senses. It involves practice. And what we're getting at here is that the emphasis on computers and cell phones and social networks, that's contributing to cultural amnesia, because you cannot get a sense of history in terms of its complexity and its lived dimensions. You just get more abstractions. And so we're in a double bind here, that what we take to be progress is actually undermining the possibility of exercising ecological intelligence, which we do in a whole variety of areas, but we haven't moved that beyond where we begin to see the connection between our behaviors, our community, and the ecosystems that we are dependent upon. It's still too centered on an individual perspective or approach to ecological intelligence.
So, all right, I'm hearing a lot about abstraction versus engagement. And yet somehow the context right here, it seems very, very left brain, very theoretical. I'm wondering, can you like give some concrete examples of how this would percolate down into a teaching or classroom situation? What would a teacher do differently to communicate this broader, deeper paradigm?
Well, very simple. Words have a history. Whose thought process is encoded in that metaphor of individualism or progress, or the root metaphors? Okay? What is the vocabulary that's excluded by patriarchy as an example of a root metaphor? Okay? That's part of our history. We can look back and identify that. What's excluded in root metaphor of mechanism? And how is that, does that take into account some kind of ecological accountability? Or is it numbers, efficiency, technological progress?
I'll give you another example too. I went to my granddaughter's choral recital that occurred at the Holt Center. And it was a part of the National Association for Music Education. And they brought students together, and they housed these students in the Holt or at the Hilton, and they had a woman who is nationally renowned work with these kids for 12 hours the day before the performance. These kids had never seen one another, but that was that face-to-face relationship and tutoring and rehearsal and getting to know people left and right, and they provided absolute magic. And then after it was over, a woman from the National Music Association made a presentation, and she said, look, after that performance, I'm not going to go into the normal stuff. And she just said some words from the heart about intelligence being a mixture of those arts and that more traditional literacy and math and science. And that if you didn't have the art side, you probably were lacking, you were deficient. And then there was another woman who is known throughout the nation as a researcher in music, and she connects to communities. So she's got, and she's from the Northwestern University, she's got various groups throughout the nation that she has connected to artists in the community to accelerate learning and expand their notion of music and how it can be played and how it can be rendered in a way that has a different way than just what you would see in a printed form description. So that's the real-time learning that also engages young people. And it's so easy now to text and look at this international stuff, and it's wrong. It's misleading. So
one of the ways of relating to the diversity of our population that thrilled me was to go to an individual educational assessment and the IEP program for a learning disabled child. That has to be done in a smaller class, but by God, I think that every student in the world would benefit to follow his own interests and his own strengths, and the schools would learn so much more about what students are and where they're going and what they need if they looked at each one as an individual and found out what they can do.
well, that's a good point. Oregon has a law stating that every child should have a plan and profile. But, you know, there's the good and the bad. I think the plan and profile needs to also talk about a relationship back to the community. you know, what their interest is and how they're learning their math or their music and the rest of
In
this.
special education, that has to be done.
Yeah.
It is absolute necessity because
Yep.
of the various challenges that they meet.
One of the things of Bateson's work that I really appreciated was his willingness to disclose his own mistakes and error patterns in his thinking. And I think traditional education tries to focus, and one of the key words is evidence-based learning. And my response when I hear that is evidence except the mistakes you don't want to tell me about. And the kind of metaphor for that is our medical system and doctors and hospitals. And in 1999, the National Institute of Medicine came out and said somewhere between 40 and 90,000 deaths a year occur in hospitals due to medical errors. And part of our whole education system is based on, we've discovered the right way to think, this is the right way to think, and you learn it, and we're not going to talk about errors because errors are something that isn't legitimate to talk about. And we end up with a system that is totally dishonest from my point of view in terms of the research system that pretends that they've solved something when they haven't really talked about. They've excluded a whole lot of results because those are embarrassing, those are negative. And so it's a system that is, and what I appreciated about Bateson's work is he continually talked about his error patterns and knowledge. And we had dialogues with his daughter that he would use that as examples of, you know, how we got into negative thought patterns and error patterns and all that kind of stuff. And so I think, from my point of view, that's a key ingredient of switching around our system is, and what I say is the results of ourselves in the community go all the way from the best successes of our entire career to the worst mistakes of our entire career. And if we're going to be honest, we need to talk about those worst mistakes.
We need the language and the awareness to be able to do that.
Go ahead.
One thing I've noticed here is it seems like all of the education is talked about in the context of the educational system, and that we're doing it with the young people, this and that, and why is there no conversation of society always thriving to educate? It's like sometimes when you're in the system, that's the education, but what's the continuing education of the species in the society for all time and growth? And there are people that are professional students and stuff, but for all people to be growing, which contributes perhaps to the simplicity or creativity that perhaps we need. Comments with regards to those thoughts. And this gentleman, by being here, he's doing more than he thinks. He's at least opened his mind where no one else has. So I think.
Well, he helped open my mind when I was
Yeah, so
sitting in his classes.
You need to give yourself a little more credit. There you go. Okay.
Well, when you begin to focus on language, differences which make a difference also involve the use of language. And we're saying that many of these words we take for granted encode earlier ways of intelligence. And I think we could actually measure intelligence by measuring the intelligence encoded in the language. You know, was it intelligence to refer to women in biased ways? Was it intelligent to refer to the environment as something exploitable? Was it intelligent? So when you think of language, it's really fundamental. Then it's not just schools. What's going on in the political discourse right now is reinforcing a lot of abstract metaphors and framing them in a way that motivates people to action, but without really understanding. what the contexts are. And that's what Nora Bateson was going to talk about context. But context is really another way of talking about differences which make a difference, which we access more fully when we rely upon all of our senses and when we have mentors and so on. Anyway, I think people are getting a little tired, and maybe we ought to, you had a question.
I just want to follow up on what you were saying about looking at education outside of the educational system. Because I think one of the root metaphors you didn't mention is this idea of institutions, like the institution's taking care of it. You know, the schools are taking care of it. It's not our responsibility. And I'm an educator, and you know, you get isolated in this box, you know, and then you're dying to connect with the community, and there just aren't a lot of avenues in our time frame, because when you're an educator, the amount of hours you work per week, it's pretty grinding. So that's one thing, just to think about, like, how we can connect the schools and the community, kind of following up. And the other thing is, I would love to hear kind of a short term, what are specific things that we could do to make schools better now in a totally flawed system? And then also, what's the long vision in terms of where do we want to take this big, boxy, awkward institution?
I'll respond to some part of that. The immediacy issue is a huge issue. If you look at what the governor is structuring, and the LearnWorks effort and some other organizations that try to input some structure in the governor's new system, he's looking at 2025 before you begin to even measure success. I can tell you that people of color can't wait that long. You either educate them or you incarcerate them. And the judge and the penal system, they all say, hey, we cannot afford this. We need to invest in everybody. So if you look at short term, I think that the schools need to develop the dialogue with the community, and not in a perfunctory fashion where they just check off the box that we talk to the community. They need people like Chet to engage in that conversation to help the district understand how they can have a deeper access to important ideas. But right now, you've got a school system that is afraid of failure, and they won't admit failure, and so it's a very, very opaque system, and they think they'll correct it within the educational framework. They don't understand reaching out. I bring up comments frequently at the board about community connections. And I will have doctors in education come up to me and say, Art, I don't get it. What do you mean community connections? And so there's a real big chasm, because these folks have been so isolated in their world of education that to communicate in a broad, transparent fashion is a real threat. And then when you've got the feds and everybody else talking about accountability and assessment and measurement systems, it really has the teachers in a terrible bind, because they not only have to perform what the administration tells them they have to do, but they also, a lot of them, moralistically, will do the magical stuff. And that takes a lot of hard work, because it's a double duty kind of job experience.
You know, everything I've talked about should be part of what teachers talk about with students, about language, about the cultural commons, and these things can be introduced very easily. For example, if you had students from different ethnic backgrounds, look at their communities and ask the question, what do people do together that has not been monetized? Because that's the other part of this is enclosure, that is taking what is intergenerational skills, activities, relationships that have been carried forward and refined. And some of this stuff is pretty bad, okay? I'm not romanticizing the cultural commons, but if they would look at their own communities and ask, what are the things that are being enclosed where we're no longer able to pass that intergenerational knowledge and skill on, and what still remains that is essential to our identity, to our mutual support systems, and to me, discovering an interest or talent that I will not find in the world of work as it's currently organized. I mean, a little bit of theory needs to be, you can't just say, students, go figure it out, because they'll figure it out in terms of these interpretive frameworks that they've acquired it through the languaging process that they acquired from the previous generation. You've got to explain, for example, words have a history. When you're using a computer, you're meeting not the words, you're meeting the mind of the people who wrote the program and selected those words. It's mind meeting mind, okay? It's root metaphors that show up in the thought processes. But few teachers have that background to ask that question. What does the technology amplify and reduce? What does print amplify? A lot of good things, and what does it reduce? A lot of very important things, okay? Anyway, I think we better close this off.
Take a break. Break time. Clock stretch, you know.
Well, I'd like the